G'day. Welcome to Lunch Buddy. We are your online and social media home for special situations, workouts and capital raising professionals. My name is Nick Samios. I am the fund manager and director here at Hermes Capital, and I am your Lunch Money live stream and podcast host. So a very special and warm welcome to you. Well, what have you been doing this week? I'll tell you what I've been doing this week. I flew to Perth and back, and I flew on Virgin. And it certainly got me thinking a lot about the aviation sector. With the borders now open, we're able to jump on planes and travel about the place. Obviously, aviation was a big part of the news last year with what Virgin went through, and now they're back on their feet again with the support of Bain Capital. And it's very interesting to see what's going on there. When the big aircraft stopped flying last year, it did make some structural changes to the smaller operators. And I think that aviation is a fascinating space on a number of levels. Firstly, we're seeing an industry go through a restructure or a workout, if you like, at an industry level. We're seeing what the knock-on effects are for the smaller players. But it's also a little bit of a view, a line of sight into the business community and the economy generally. So we have got, I think it is very safe to say, arguably Australia's two best aviation experts. I'm willing to take a challenge on that. If you don't think that that David Crick and Sebastian Hams aren't the two best guys to have on your team in an aviation situation, I'd like you to tell me who it might be instead. Before we introduce those guys, I would like to appeal to you to share, like, or subscribe to our podcast. Share it with your friends. If you subscribe or hit the reminder button on YouTube, you'll get a little reminder and you won't miss an episode. That said, a lot of people say to me, "Oh, I missed out on Friday because I was busy doing such and such." We're a podcast as well. You can listen to us on your iPhone or on your Google phone. And this week we've just joined iHeartRadio and Audible. So you'll be able to listen to us there as well. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first guest, and that will be David Crick. G'day, David. How are you?
Hi, Nick. Very well, very well. Thank you very much.
Fantastic to have you on board. Now, I mean, looking at your profile here, I'm not sure where to begin. You've been involved with so much. I mean, firstly, you're an aviation valuer. You value helicopters, which are rotary wings for the novices, and fixed wing aircraft, which are the things that the rest of us just call aeroplanes, but also the ancillary things that go with aviation as well. You've been a lecturer at the Embry-Riddle Aeronautic University College of Business for Aviation Appraisal Theory and Practice, which is quite interesting. There's a whole bunch of that stuff on your CV, which is really interesting. I mean, the point is that you've been around this space for a long time. So what's been keeping you busy this week?
Man, there's just a lot going on in the aviation space, and in terms of both transactions and financing. And I guess we're quite busy this week with probably four things, and the four different things. One is what we would probably term mergers and acquisitions, where aviation entities are either in a process of merging or being acquired. The other is still around acquisitions, but it is more about individual aircraft that are being acquired primarily from offshore. So private aircraft that are being acquired from the US or Europe or South Africa. The third is pre-lend. There seems to be a lot of traction with finance at the present, and people either needing more assets or wanting to leverage their assets. And then the fourth thing that we've been busy on this week is some litigation issues around disputes with aviation assets. So that's probably the four things that we're finding are quite busy at present.
That's fascinating, really. I mean, we've today's podcast is sort of focusing on aviation. A lot of people might think, well, that's a little bit specific for me, but let's just look at those 4 points that you've raised. Firstly, M&As. I mean, I've said before, we featured M&As a couple of weeks ago more broadly, but obviously there's a lot of M&A activity in the aviation space, and is that we said earlier, and we'll come to it a little bit later, but aviation there's general aviation. There's the also fly in, fly out. For what in what sort of areas is the M&A activity?
So some of it is consolidation in terms of the market is quite crowded in specific areas. For example, we saw that CHC Helicopters has put a bid together to purchase Babcock and their offshore capabilities in terms of oil and gas offshore transportation. We also see other areas where successful operations here in Australia are looking at offers from overseas equity and capital organisations to purchase their operations. So it's quite busy with that respect.
Wow, that is interesting. And on the pre-lend side, so how are the brokers? I speak to a couple of guys that specialise in this space.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, leaving aviation aside, just as a general thing, people are saying, look, we're getting deals done, but they just take a long time.
That's true.
Now, one deal that I saw in the aviation space, so is there a feeling that the banks are wanting you to really have, I was looking at a situation where someone had a turboprop and he wanted to buy a jet. And I think the bank's attitude is, well, do you really need a jet, to fly around the place? Is there a bit of that, or what are the bankers telling you?
My perception is the banks are probably a bit gun shy in their attitude towards financing aircraft with respect to sometimes their mentality their mindset may come from that commercial aircraft space. And in that commercial aircraft space, the risk is high at the present with the number of aircraft that are in preservation or parked. I think there's close to 12,000 aircraft that are currently parked around the world. So financiers and funding institutions are seeing that as a risk, rightly so. But there's probably 5 different sectors around the aviation space, and each one of them acts very differently. So a commercial aircraft acts differently to a freighter aircraft, which acts differently to a general aviation aircraft, which acts differently to a helicopter or a private jet. So each market segment needs to have its own assessment as to what is risk and what isn't.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's very interesting. I guess you said that there's 12,000 of these things that are on the ground in care and maintenance, I suppose, to use mining terminology. And the other point you make there, aviation is very much a global business, right? For a start, aircraft are usually valued in US dollars. You're not necessarily just looking for local buyers. It's a matter, buyers come from all over the world. I remember a number of years ago, it was my first experience in selling a jet. It was a Bombardier, something or other, with a range of 6,000 kilometres. The first thing was, you go, geez, for 6,000 kilometres, you could go from here to Fiji, and from Fiji to Colombia or somewhere. You never see the thing again. But it is very much a global business, isn't it?
It is. You're right. It's very much valued and priced in US dollars in the primary, and it is a global market. And the reality is, they're a mobile asset that are able to be placed anywhere. So that's the case. And I think that it's more around the operation than it is around the asset. For example, you might have some, longer range or regional aircraft that can seat, say, 100 passengers. And we can see that in some industries, like, for example, what's called RPT, or regular passenger transport, with your Virgins, your Qantases and the like, they're having quite the struggle at the moment because of various border restrictions and passenger take-ups. But you have another entity with the same size aircraft that can seat 100 passengers. And there's an operator here in Australia, for example, Alliance Airlines. They're quite broad-based in their approach, and not only doing regular passenger transport, but also mining work and charter operations. So their aircraft are very busy, and I think that the management of Alliance has got a lot of credibility, and a lot of kudos goes to them on the basis that they've diversified what they do, and they're actually finding a way to use their aircraft.
Well, I must say I've sort of watched them from a distance, and they've really, they've gone from strength to strength over, say, the past 6 or 7 years. I think it's fair to say. I think that that they have been quite the success story. Okay, listen, we could talk all day, David, but we do have our other guest, Sebastian Hams. So I'm going to put you back in the flight lounge, and we'll introduce Sebastian Hams. G'day, Sebastian. How you going?
I'm well, thank you, Nick. How are you?
Very good. Sebastian's a partner at KordaMentha in Melbourne. You're sitting in Melbourne right now as we speak. You were the financial controller of Crystal Palace Football Club.
Yes, in another life, back in 2002. Yeah, quite some time ago.
Wow. I mean, that is fascinating. I'd love to talk to you about that. Interestingly enough, I'm hoping next week to get Gino Mara as a guest. He's the chairman of the newest A-League team. And I'm hoping that he's going to tell us all about the journey that he's been on getting that going. But look, you were involved in Ansett. You were on the administrators team there. You were a receiver of Brindabella. You were an advisor to Bain on the recent transaction with respect to Virgin. So I'm pretty happy to stand by my assertion that probably you're the man when it comes to this stuff. Tell me, what's keeping you busy of late?
Keeping us busy. So, I mean, last year was a fantastic year for us acting for Bain to buy Virgin, a great acquisition, and lots of challenges in the market there with the uncertainty in the ramp up and the international travel return. So that's sort of still keeping us busy in terms of a couple of discrete roles with the Virgin and Bain guys. Other stuff that's keeping us busy is actually quite similar to what David was talking about. Some inquiries from bank and financiers, and a lot of that, to your point, Nick, is around actually understanding what's going on in the aviation market, understanding those different sectors, different aircraft types, what they do, what their KPIs are, where the risks are, because it is a little bit of an unknown. So a lot of people just give us a call just to understand. And the other part of it, I think that's actually really interesting, is playing out globally, and we sort of talked about this quickly beforehand, was what's happening in that financing space with the various bonds and so on and so forth. So there's a lot happening around the world. As David said, there's an awful lot of aircraft on the ground around the world. So there's been a complete structural reset of the global aviation market, and that's playing out as we speak.
And that's interesting, I suppose, again, because of your experience. So you're getting people picking up the phone to you when they're looking at M&As, for example, on the economics and the markets generally?
Yeah, and that's right. Look, there's a lot of money floating around at the moment. Everyone knows that. And there's a lot of interest in aviation. One of the dangers with aviation is everyone still thinks it's this fascinating, romantic industry. But at the end of the day, it's pretty cutthroat. It's pretty hard work. Your safety, and this goes without saying, but your safety has to be, beyond compare. So it is a really, really tough business. You only have to look at the Australian competitive market to understand how tough it is in both the RPT, the charter, and the general aviation space.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking a bit earlier. What has been interesting is with fewer aircraft, with fewer passenger aircraft flying around, some of the smaller freight guys have picked up extra freight work, and even some of the fly-in, fly-out stuff. Because they've got different, smaller aircraft and different configurations, if you like. It certainly creates those sorts of opportunities. The plane that I caught, I went to Perth and back, and the plane was full. I mean, it was chockers, and there was a few spare seats, but there's fewer flights available. I mean, how do you see all of that main stuff ramping up again? Will there be more flights, and will we be back to normal, or what are they saying in those circles?
Yeah, look, I hope you find Virgin, Nick. But
nothing else, mate. Only Virgin. Yep.
That's great. So look, Virgin have gone, as everyone knows, to a 737 fleet. Fleet simplification is really important. One fleet, it takes a lot of the complexity out of the business. In terms of what the market's going to do, it'll be a slow and careful ramp up, I think, which presents a lot of challenges. We in Australia were, I think, very lucky in terms of being able to hibernate our businesses, and I don't say that just with aviation. You basically we, by virtue at Virgin of going through voluntary administration, were able to put the planes on what's called power by hour. So, you pay for what you use. That, in conjunction with JobKeeper, essentially we variabilised all our costs. So we were able to do that. Now, the challenge for a lot of businesses, both in Australia and globally, is they haven't been able to do that. And, we see with Aer Lingus, for example, issuing those bonds, that's essentially what they're trying to cover, the lack of the ability to variabilise their cost. And then when you talk to the ramp up, there's aircraft on the ground around the world. So the availability of aircraft is there. It takes a bit of time to get them into service, and so this will happen. And the challenge is what that ramp up looks like, both domestically and internationally, and there'll be different timelines.
I would have thought, David said there's 12,000 aircraft. I appreciate they're all different shapes and sizes and all the rest of it. But regardless, the point is there's a lot of aircraft just sitting around, and money is at ridiculous. We've got zero interest rates, although personally I think that's going to change shortly. But if you need to get your hands on it, was there 737-400s that are in the Virgin fleet?
800s, yeah.
800s, yeah. So if you suddenly need to pick up an extra half a dozen of those, they're probably sitting somewhere in a desert, in the US. There's availability.
There is availability.
Yeah.
The Rex guys have done a very sensible thing and picked up. I think they've got 6 now, 2 on the ground or something like that. I think 5 of the 6 are ex-Virgin, so they came out of the Virgin fleet. Sensible stuff.
Yeah. Okay, listen, we will bring David back. And Sebastian, you just mentioned the Aer Lingus bond, so I might just flash that up. The Aer Lingus owner, IAG, to raise $1.2 billion survival bond. Now, the first thing that I would say about that is that obviously the marketing department hasn't been anywhere near that announcement, because I'm not sure I would be calling them survival bonds. They sound like war bonds, but would you be subscribing to those, David? What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think so. There's lots of different methodologies that capital raising is using at the moment. We're aware of some capital raising by putting a lien against the spares that each individual airline uses, and basically using it as like a cash flow lend to basically provide some sort of liquid finance in order to keep the thing afloat, and that's very common.
Okay, yeah, all right. What do you think of that, Sebastian? Obviously, as someone who's been on the inside with Ansett and Virgin, what do you think that'll be a successful bond raise? And I think we were talking before. This isn't going to mum and dads. This will be going to institutions.
Well, look, as I said before, there's a lot of money out there. If you sort of just wind it back, what this is doing is Aer Lingus, and they're not on their own. Every business or every airline around the world has been burning cash. So simply, what they're doing is if they haven't been able to reset their cost base and essentially put their assets into hibernation, and I include people in that, they're going to have been burning cash. So this is, to call it a survival bond, is just extending the life of the airline. Qantas did it. So there's lots of cheap money out there. It'll get away, provided people can see a return to some sort of status quo in the next 6 to 12 months.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Now, one of the thing David said before. Obviously, there's different sectors, in the aircraft industry. There's guys that are running mail. There's guys that are running fly-in, fly-outs. You've got tourism operators. I think you mentioned, David, about the guys that are hopping around the oil rigs, I guess, is what you were talking about before. What are the main sectors, and what are some of the challenges that these different sectors are facing, if you want to sort of zero in on a sector?
Sure. Yeah. So some of the sectors are reasonably constant, and others are quite fluid. And I guess, like for example, freighter aircraft. The majority of freight that flies around the globe literally is basically done as an adjunct to passenger transport. And when passenger transport was reduced with the pandemic, there was a period at the beginning of the pandemic when there was around 70% of aircraft that were sitting on the ground. And since then, I think narrow body, which is the 737s and the A320s, that's reduced to around 60% now. 40%, whereas the wide bodies are much higher still. But freighters, there's an 18-month wait to get into a freighter conversion shop, and just to convert a 737 or an A320 is going to cost you $4 million just to convert it from a passenger aircraft to a freighter. So there are some inhibitions to entry there, and if people have got freighter aircraft, obviously the values and prices are going up on the basis that there's scarcity of supply and requirement for demand.
Interesting. I've got a friend who's a logistics manager for an FMCG business, and he says the logistics between the East Coast and the West Coast are just diabolical. I mean, are aircraft picking up any of that slack, or what's the?
Yeah, freighter are absolutely. Yeah, freighter aircraft are busy beyond belief at the present, and that goes from small turboprop aircraft, doing charter runs and moving, mail and flowers and what have you around the place, to large, solely freight aircraft that are moving, big heavy loads into, mining communities or regional communities. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess, Sebastian, with the mining sector is obviously, particularly in WA, for example, the mining sector is going very well over there. I guess that means that if you're in the fly-in, fly-out game, it's pretty good. I'm just interested on the freight side. How does the economics of freight fit in with those large, with an airline like Virgin, for example? How does the economics of freight plug into the models there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the economics of freight simply plug into the RPT model by virtue of carrying freight in the belly of the aircraft. So, it's reasonably simplistic in terms of the resource game and the charter game. With iron ore at $170 a ton, they're trying to get people up there as fast as they can. One of the things that'll actually be interesting and where the main game is with fly in, fly out is not so much in the production side of it. It's actually in the infrastructure and in the investment phase. So if the prices stay up like they are at the moment with iron ore and gold, etc., and we see another investment phase, that's when the real benefit comes through. It's not so much in the production phase.
So just to sort of segue into mining there, just for a bit, do you think, are we about to see another investment phase? Because obviously we had a huge investment phase sort of, 5 to 10 years ago, I guess. When that came to an end, the mining boom was over, more or less. Is that ramping up again, you think?
Well, look, I mean, if the pricing stays up, it's natural that it will. I'm probably getting a little out of my wheelhouse when we start talking about China and, impact of Brazil and so on and so forth. But, I'm pretty comfortable that I speak for all airlines when I say that they'd welcome another investment phase.
Yeah. Okay. And now, when you're talking to banks, Sebastian, I'll just stay with you, and then I'll come to you on this, David. I mean, are there different sectors of aviation that banks are more concerned with, and other sectors that they're hot on? I mean, how are you? What sort of conversations are you having?
Yeah, it's probably even more than that. There's within sectors. There's risk profiles within sectors. So if you think about it, you look at aviation, and let's just take RPT for an example. They look, you'll have some financiers are looking at aircraft finance, either through leases or owned aircraft. You've then got financiers who are looking at the merchant, and what I mean by that is when you buy a ticket on credit card, you create a merchant risk. And the banks will generally bond that cash. That is a significant issue. You've then got the infrastructure around the airports. Airports are a very expensive asset. They make a lot of money, and generally the banks get pretty comfortable with that. And then you've got the downstream assets. So downstream businesses that need to be financed. So if you think about fuel, if you think about catering, you think about engineering, and everything that goes towards running an airport and an airline. There's so many finance streams in that. So it starts to get really complicated, not just within each of the sectors, but within each of the finance streams that contribute to it. So what the bankers are really looking for is to understand where they sit in the waterfall, if you like, and what's going to happen with that in the context of that uncertainty, specifically around the international ramp up.
And that really is a fascinating supply chain when you think about it. I mean, it goes from to get that bum on that seat when you think about all those different moving parts. David, what about you? Are there things that when the banks ask you to value, they're going to love it, and there's other ones that, I guess you're probably advising them as well. What to stay clear of. And
yeah, yes and no. I think the main thing that's an issue is that when we talk about regular passenger transport or RPT, it's basically cost per seat per mile, and it's without simplifying it, it's essentially an equation. Whereas in other sectors, the aircraft may be an actual operating entity, or they may be an adjunct to another business. And so, for example, in helicopters, if you're running a mustering organization, then the helicopter is essential to the service. But if you are an electrician that is got a group of guys and you're working out how to get across for all your regional clients, then the aircraft is just a tool of trade. And more so in helicopters than in fixed wing aircraft, helicopters are essentially a tool of trade. They're usually purchased for a mission specific purpose. So it might be for transporting oil and gas people. It might be for emergency medical transport or repatriation. It might be for search and rescue processes. There's a lot of reasons that you would buy a helicopter, and pretty much all of them are specific utilization based. Whereas some other aircraft are more discretionary spends, more so in the private and the general aviation space.
Right. Okay. I mean, look, what we haven't got to yet, and I'd like to get to before we run out of time, is what sort of aircraft and what's happening in the valuations of aircraft. Are they, what are the main influences at the moment? Are they holding up? Is the US dollar value, like what are the main things that are feeding into the valuations at the moment? I'll start with you, David, and then I'll come to
Sure. So with the global pandemic, some of the actual original equipment manufacturers have either reduced or closed down their shops, and they've reduced their production rates. So the actual supply of new aircraft is either lower and or slower. And so, for example, a Robinson helicopter, of which there's 2,300 helicopters in Australia, and 65% of them are Robinsons. Well, the Robinson factory, if you want a new Robinson helicopter, you're looking at later this year to get a new one. So what that's doing is it's propping up the prices of the current secondary market. We're seeing the same thing in general aviation. Single engine aircraft, for example, a Cessna 172 or a 182, they're rare as hen's teeth at the moment, and people are having to pay a premium for them. But there's other aircraft that are not as popular and not as in demand. The prices are languishing accordingly. It's all about supply and demand, as we all know.
And Sebastian, I mean, any sort of reflections on aircraft valuations and how that impacts the sort of work that you do?
Yeah, I think, look, David's point is exactly right. It's all about supply and demand. If you think about where the demand is and what's happening globally with international transport, they're essentially long-haul international aircraft are the wide-body aircraft. So you're thinking 330s, you're thinking 767s, et cetera, They're just not in demand because nobody's flying them. As opposed to you look at 737-800s, which is obviously the Virgin fleet, and Qantas are flying those. They're flying A320s. So the domestic businesses are demanding those smaller aircraft, those short haul aircraft. So that's where the values are going accordingly. There's no doubt that the values have come down on those 737-800s, right, for example, right, but not to the extent of the wide bodies.
Okay. I wonder, David, I know that when it comes to used motor vehicles, actually yellow goods, motor vehicles, trucks, etc. I mean, the used prices of those things have gone through the roof since COVID, really, because I think I think the story with cars, for example, is that the new cars aren't coming into the country, so there's no trade-ins, and so because there's no trade-ins, there's no stock. The dealers are having to go to the auctions, and so is there a similar effect with aircraft?
Yes, and I think that one of the things that happens is that if financiers and bankers are looking to fund an asset purely on an asset-based capacity and a clean asset loan, then they'll look at the asset market. For example, in private aircraft or corporate jets, the first basically 2020 was a year of two halves. The first 3 quarters was a complete disaster. We were seeing in some larger private jets, they were having reduction in values of 20, 25, 30%.
Wow.
But in that last quarter of 2020, the market went berserk and not only made up all of the losses for the first 3 quarters, but actually saw some increases in values. And so it's again, sorry to sound like a broken record, but it's all about supply and demand. And if you have a demand, you've got to look at the supply. I think the other thing that the banks and financiers are looking at when we talk about assessing risk and assessing appetite for funding, I think one of the things we're seeing is that they're more looking at the entity that's looking for the loan. So it's not just about the actual asset that is being assessed. It's also about the operator and whether they're a robust operator or whether they're a struggling operator. So they're looking at more than just the assets in what we can tell.
Right. Okay. Yeah, look, I mean, I think that applies a little bit across the board,
Of course.
to some extent anyway. But I do hear what you're saying. We were talking a little bit earlier. What do you think's happening with Rex, Sebastian? What's the go there?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting one. Great for consumers. Another entrant in the market. It's going to be tough for them. Qantas and Virgin. I don't know anything more than the average punter, but Qantas and Virgin aren't going to give up their market share. My concern for them is that 6 737s is subscale, so it's going to be very difficult to hit or make up the required overheads, especially if they're flying $49 Sydney Brisbane. I mean, it barely covers your airport charges, so that's going to be tough for them. But that said, they're tightly run. They always have been. If you look at, say, Alliance as the benchmark for a business that is really tightly run, that's what they're going to have to do. So I think it'll be really interesting to watch and see how they go.
Yeah, I guess I suppose there's cost curves there is what you're referring to. So
Yeah.
You're saying that the capacity they've got doesn't really intersect the cost curve to make the thing viable. Are you suggesting without sort of?
Yeah, I mean it's not cheap
tough.
to. Yeah, exactly, and it's not cheap to put 737s in the sky. They've been running Saab 340s for many a year since the Regional Express was formed out of Ansett in 2002. So they know what they're doing, and they operate as they will. That said, you've got another cost base to run a 737 fleet, and is 6 aircraft enough? I wouldn't have thought so, but I don't know the cost model.
I suppose they'd be looking at a lot of their regional stuff. People are hopping on at one place and then getting off at Brisbane or Sydney or whatever, and then hopping on to a Virgin or a Qantas, and they're probably wanting to pick up a slice of that action. I guess is the economics of it. What David? So getting away from obviously there's the commercial operators. What about the corporate jets? The corporate flyers. What are the trends there? Is there are more people getting their own aircraft, or how's that market look?
Surprisingly, yes, and it's reasonably driven by a US mentality that says, I don't want to be at the behest of the commercial operators, and I don't necessarily want to have to sit next to, some member of the general public that's got some set of sniffles and flus and carry on. I might catch COVID.
Is that right? Really? Is COVID a factor?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
wow.
Absolutely. Yeah, particularly in overseas markets, not here so much.
Right.
In general terms, Australia is a relatively small market for corporate jets. I mean, there's more corporate jets parked at Van Nuys Airport in California than is in the whole of Australia. So, we're a small market per se. But there is quite a level of interest and quite a level of acquisitions going on at the present. Because of that, people want to have the capacity to make their own choices about when I go, where I go, and how I go. and that is driving a lot of the demand. The demand is quite high. There's some aircraft that, particularly in the Australian landscape, like the Embraer Phenom 300, and several other versions of smaller aircraft, they're going gangbusters at the moment. Prices are quite buoyant.
Has KordaMentha got a corporate jet as yet, Sebastian? Or
no, we don't, and we will not.
What are your views there? I mean, it's funny. I guess in lending you have various sayings. I mean, there's one that there's nothing that floats, flies, or passes gas is one of the things you can imagine what the other F is there. And another thing is, I know that I used to work for a guy years ago that used to say if you walked into a business and they had a fish tank out the front, that was always a bad sign. You do a lot of pre-lending reviews and a lot of work around capital raising. I mean, what's your view on corporate jets?
I tend to agree. I love the fish tank analogy. I use that myself. I think it's really accurate, as well as the 3Fs. I think David hit the nail on the head though when you talk about the corporate jet as a tool of trade. There's a bit of ego that goes with a corporate jet, especially if you are actually flying a jet, as opposed to there's some very sensible people getting around in nice turboprops or PC-12s or something like that, which is a lot cheaper to run. On a 600-700K trip, it'll probably add another 5 minutes to your trip. So you just got to be careful. So if people are buying it as a tool of trade because they can't rely on what is a reduced RPT schedule, I get that, but you can't think you're going to make money out of it. Once you get into anything up the tree in terms of expensive corporate jets, I find it difficult to justify in Australia, to be honest.
Okay. All right, listen, we're running out of time. So, David, I'm just going to ask you, firstly, I've got some friends at Warnervale, the Central Coast airport up there at the flight school. Now, they tell me that general aviation's going pretty well at the moment.
It is. Yep, particularly for single engine. Twin engine, not as buoyant, but single engine, gangbusters at the present.
Yeah. So you're getting asked to value, the odd Cirrus and all that sort of stuff. I mean, what's flavour of the month at the moment?
Cirruses are quite go. Even larger turboprop, single turboprop like Caravans and Piper Meridians, Pilatuses. If you find one, grab onto it because they're hard to find, particularly later model. There's a rush to later model, better quality, but at the end of the day, you can only work with what's in the marketplace.
Okay, and just your closing thoughts, and then I'll come to you, Sebastian, for your closing thoughts.
Look, aviation is a robust industry, and it has very, very many sectors. And I guess from a financing perspective and an asset reliability perspective, do your homework and you will not go wrong. Very
good. Okay, Sebastian?
Yeah, my closing thought, and this is just to simplify things, I like to think of RPT aviation as very similar to a fruit and veg shop because it's about bums on seats. Because once that seat's gone, it's gone. You can't resell it. So it's about utilisation of your fleet. You got to sweat your fleet and yield. So pricing. So to David's point, understand the business, talk to the right people, and you won't go far wrong.
Okay, fantastic. Well, it's been a real privilege to have both of you today because I really do sincerely mean it. I mean, as far as if you're going to talk aviation, then you guys are probably the best two guys to speak to. So thank you very much, David Crick from DavAir for joining me and Sebastian Hams from KordaMentha. It's been, as I say, it's been a real honour and thank you very much.
Appreciate being involved. Thanks, Nick.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Nick.